right. So what do IO psychologists do? Well, they work in selection a lot. A lot of organizations need help in deciding how to select employees from the pool of applicants. And so that's a really big job for IO psychologists. Another place where organizations will reach out will be in the training component. A lot of the trainings that we have to do to meet standards in our workplace are things that are originally worked up by IO psychologists. So sexual harassment training and diversity training and those kinds of things are worked up by IO psychologists who maybe sell what they worked up, and now they've got like this course, but they made a bunch of money off of it on the front side, that kind of thing. So training development would be more about the kind of training where we're helping you to move forward in the actual organization as far as like your skills and stuff like that. Organizational development, a lot of times organizations have a vision and they're not exactly sure how to achieve it. Like what steps should we follow or what are we missing? We don't seem to be getting where we want to go. So they'll help with that. Performance appraisal and management. So how do we know whether the training worked? How do we know whether the employee is actually reaching the stated goals? And how do we manage performance? Quality of work life has become a really hot topic in IO psychology over the past 15 years. Are people's work lives fulfilling? Are they achieving their own personal goals and things like that? Consumer psychology is another area that IO psychologists oftentimes will dabble in. Sort of the idea of how do we lure customers? How do we attract from all the people who might want to buy something that this organization sells or do something that this organization does? How do we get consumers to come to us instead? Human factors engineering, this is where IO psychologists will help to design the workplace in such a way that it interfaces with the employee to the best advantage. So designing workstations that would help to reduce carpal tunnel disease or lower back issues or things like that. I know there was a big hullabaloo in the IO world when Amazon was very concerned about the back injuries that their employees were getting in the warehouses. And a human factors engineer came up with the idea of offsetting the handles on the boxes so that they are not, instead of across from each other, they're offset so that when you turn, you're in a natural position for your back rather than torquing your back. Little things like that help to reduce workplace injuries and overuse injuries and things like that. All right. How much do IO psychologists earn? Just full disclosure, this picture from US News and World Reports is lumping together people with master's degrees and PhDs. So master's degrees are going to be towards the lower end of the scale. PhDs are going to be, in the median and above, typically. You can command a higher hourly salary when you have a PhD than you can if you have a master's degree. But even having said that, the master's degree level is earning pretty decently. So we've got a range. The bottom 25% of earners are around $90,000 a year, and the top 25% are going to be top 25%. Their minimum is going to be $219,410. Like that's the bottom of the top 25%. So if you keep going off into that right hand wing, you're going to see who knows how high those salaries go. The median, where half of the people earn more than this and half of the people earn less than this, is $147,420. So it's a very well-paying field. It's the highest of all the psychology fields. Here we have from JobCase, they lined up comparatively, and again, this is median salaries for each of these, or average salaries for each of these fields. And so you see the industrial psychologist at about, they've got them at 150. Mean doesn't always line up with the median, but anyway, so industrial psychologist is around 150. Regular clinical psychologist is a little bit more than 100,000. A statistician or a psychometrist is going to make about 100,000. School psychology is going to be a little less than 100,000. So of the psychologists, IO psychology is far and above earning more than any other field. A lot of people think clinical psychology is where you want to make your money, but it turns out IO psychologist is where you want to make your money. Now, comparing to some other fields, So IO psychologist is this third bar here. So a straight human resources manager is probably going to make more. A training and development manager is going to make more. So this is sort of like an IO psychologist with some business training that is now full employed by an organization. They're probably going to make a little bit more than an IO psychologist, who more than likely is going to be sort of a contract worker or, working as a consultant kind of thing. So, but that gives you a lot of freedom when you work as a consultant. So you have to hustle when you want work, but then on the other hand, you have a lot of freedom. So you can make a lot of money and not necessarily be doing a 40-hour work week like the human resources manager and the training and development manager would be doing. Then we've got management analysts below the IO psychologist, the regular psychologist again, the clinical or school psychologist down here, and then human resource specialist, which is not the same as a resources manager. So it seems even comparing across different fields, it would be kind of similar, but maybe not, having anything to do with psychology. We see that IO psychologists are faring really well, and I can't overstate too much the benefits of being able to maybe work for a cluster of time and then take some time off and then find another position and work for a cluster of time to end up with that kind of salary, and having that lifestyle is really a benefit. All right, let's cover very briefly the history of IO psychology. So before World War I, you might be going, wait, before World War I thought IO psychology was a new field. It is not a new field. It's something that I hear all the time. Oh, I know, that's a real new field up and coming in psychology. No, it's been around since the beginning. When psychology was founded, Wilhelm Wundt in his lab in 1879, as soon as any research started coming in, people started thinking in very applied ways. So very quickly, educational psychology came along. How can we help students to learn better? Clinical types of psychology came along. How can we help people to, deal with psychological disorder or live their best life? And then IO psychology came along. How can we improve employee performance and enhance people's lives? I'm giving credit to Walter Dill Scott as one of the first people to really bring IO psychology to the forefront. In 1901, he gave a talk on the psychology of advertising. That's not necessarily a full field of IO psychology. Advertisement is kind of more of a business thing. In 1903, he published a book called The Theory of Advertising. But here's the thing. He was the first professor of what Carnegie Tech called applied psychology. And applied psychology is sort of code for IO. It ultimately is going to morph into industrial, and then it'll further morph into IO. So I'm going to say the fact that he was in psychology makes me think he's one of the early ancestors of IO psychology. Now, Hugo Munsterberg is who our textbook attributes as the founder of IO Psych, and PSYOP does also. So I'm a little different than PSYOP and our textbook in giving Walter Dill Scott a nod. Hugo Munsterberg he published a book called Psychology and Industrial Efficiency. And so what he was looking at is how to improve employee performance. That is classic industrial psychology for sure. And so I can see why people credit him with being the founder. So as early, we'll say for sure by 1913, we've got industrial. We've got at least the I side starting to develop. Now in World War I through the 1920s, there was a lot of military personnel work going on as World War II was ramping up and we needed to select. I always love it when we have a draft and then we call it the selective service, because I guess once you've been drafted, they were looking to make sure you were fit. But what they wanted to do during World War I is have some kind of objective way to figure out who should be in what kinds of jobs within the military during the war. And so Robert Yerkes developed the Army Alpha and Beta mental tests. The Alpha test was for people who could read and write in English. And then the Beta tests were for people who couldn't read or write, or at least couldn't read or write in English. And so they were considered comparable forms of the same test, but one was required language and the other one didn't. these tests were used to determine who should be maybe an office person during the war, or who should be a truck driver during the war, or who should be sort of in the trenches during the war, like that. And so that was the first time that the military had ever had some kind of concrete way of deciding who belonged where. And they did it based on the score that you earned on this mental ability test. Pretty quickly, when they saw that this was actually a pretty effective way of assigning people to positions, the use of these kinds of placement tests expanded out into other government jobs and then into private industry as a way to screen people out who might not have what it takes to perform well on the job, regardless of what the job was. Now, in 1921, Bruce V. Moore became the first PhD in what would become industrial psychology. I put IO there just for our fun, but it was industrial psychology. At Carnegie Tech. Remember on the last slide I mentioned Carnegie Tech had that applied psychology program that very quickly became the industrial psychology program. He wrote a questionnaire that actually is still in use today called the Strong Vocational Interest blank for men. It's no longer called for men, but the strong vocational interest blank is, we would today, instead of using the word blank, we would say like questionnaire or scale. It's going to measure your strong vocational interests. Well, in this case, if you're male. And so he developed this, he was a psychometrist. He developed this scale that would allow us to figure out who was good at what vocations, what jobs would be good matches for who. He served as the first president of Division 14 of the APA, which at this time was called the Society for Industrial Psychology. Frederick Taylor came along, and I don't actually know what year exactly he developed the field of scientific management. And then Lillian Gilbreth, again, there's not a specific date associated with her, but it's during this time. She wrote a book called The Psychology of Management, and she did a bunch of like inventions that she at least gave people the idea for, and then they brought it to life. Some of them you're really familiar with, like she is the person that is credited with coming up with the idea of a trash can that has a lever on the bottom that you could step on and then the lid pops up. She was the one who came up with that idea. She also came up with the idea of putting shelves on the refrigerator door, inside the refrigerator door, so you can, for your butter and like that. She's like, why do we have this wasted space? She was really big on efficiency. And so, interesting story about Lillian Gilbreth, though. She had earned a PhD at UC Berkeley in like 1909 or something like that. She sat for her dissertation defense. Everything was great, but the university refused to award her degree because she hadn't fulfilled the residency requirement. Apparently, students were required to live on campus, and she hadn't done that because she was married and had a few kids already by the time she earned her PhD. So they never awarded it to her. She was married to another student who got his PhD in human factors engineering. He got a teaching job, so they moved, and she went to school again and got another PhD, and this time they awarded it to her. And she actually got her PhD awarded 2 weeks before her 7th child was born. She went on to have a total of 10 children, and you might know her family because they were depicted in probably what you would be familiar with is a movie called Cheaper by the Dozen. They did a remake recently, but it had originally been really strongly based on the book that one of her children wrote about the efficiency strategies that her mom and dad implemented while raising 10 children. And one of their philosophies was, well, everything's cheaper by the dozen. So, actually this is efficient to have so many children because we can afford, look, we buy it in bulk and like that. So she in the 1920s was, a very go-getter kind of person that you might not have expected. You might have a stereotype of what it would be like to be a woman in the 1920s. She had all these children. I don't know how she did. A lot of the things that the kids talk about is how she implemented, sort of management strategies on her children to keep everything in order and everything running. Anyway, I thought that would be an interesting story for you to hear. All right, from the 1930s to pre-World War II, we see that the effects of the Great Depression. So as the depression progressed, we have a lot of organizations, particularly businesses, laying off employees, but still needing to meet quotas, right? So the organizations would be willing to hire IO psychologists or I psychologists at this time to come out and give them advice on efficiencies and employee motivations and stuff. So one of these cases was at the Western Electric plant in Hawthorne, Illinois, and the industrial psychologists were asked, how can we boost productivity in this light bulb factory? And one of the first things that the psychologist said was, well, you've got a bunch of lights burned out. Why don't you fix that? And then people can see better and they'll perform better. And so they implemented the advice. They said, oh, great, productivity has really gone up. Thank you for your work. And then very quickly, it went back to normal. Productivity dropped again. So they brought the IO psychologist back out. They said, okay, we want our money's worth, so try again. And they said, well, it's pretty dingy in here. Maybe even with good illumination, it's pretty dark in here. Why don't you paint the walls a light color, and that'll be motivating, and they can see better. So they did. They painted the whole factory. Productivity went up, and then it dropped back down again. So the psychologist came back out and said, well, it's kind of stuffy in here. I see that you have fans moving the air around. Maybe it would feel cooler psychologically if you put some ribbons on the fan that hang down. Then people can see that the air is moving and they'll feel better. So they did that and productivity went up, but as you would guess, it went back down. So now we're curious. Okay, good scientists first, practitioners second. They're thinking, okay, well, now we're going to have to start doing some tests. So they started reversing the things that they had already done. They said, well, take some light bulbs out. Productivity went up, then it went back down. Paint the walls a darker color. Productivity went up, then it went back down. And they said no matter what change we did, pro, con, good, different, following research, predictions or not, everything we do boosts productivity and then it goes back to normal. Something's going on. And this is how they discovered what's now called the Hawthorne effect. The idea that people will perform differently if they know they're being watched. And so there were really important things that came out of the 1930s as IO psychologists were going out into the work world trying to boost efficiency and trying to help those employees who were left after Depression era layoffs to perform at their best. There were a big shift in attitude to focus on social and psychological conditions of work. So they started to worry about, how do teams develop within a workplace? What does good supervision look like? How can we help groups to function efficiently? How do we motivate employees? If we don't have enough money in our organization to pay them lots of money, is there something else we can do to motivate employees? And so those factors came in, and those were big, important things that are going to help to lead to the development of the organizational side. All right, I'm going to stop here because I've been talking a while, and we'll come back and talk about the effects of World War II and then through the mid-1960s.